the word faith immediately gives you a religious overtones, but the New Testament Greek word for faith, pistis, is different. Faith implies some doctrine. I believe in some doctrine. It implies that. Pistis, in the sense of trust, is more an emotional thing. It's I trust my friends. When I was a boy, I trusted my mom and my dad, you see. That kind of trust, where you surrender the autonomy and the rigidity of your ego to a benign force and allow yourself to be guided. And that kind of openness and trust and belief is what can be such a powerful inducer of the creative energies of the personality, that they're all waiting there. I'm convinced that there's treasures, latent treasures in all of us, but we need it's a mystery how to unleash it.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode I am joined by author and philosopher Michael Grosso to discuss his books, Yoga of Sound, The Life and Teachings of the Celestial Songman, Swami Nada Brahmananda, and Smile of the Universe, Miracles in an Age of Disbelief. Among many topics, Michael discusses living life as a spiritual practice, how literal-mindedness is the enemy of the imagination, and how miracles are still happening all around us. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. Michael Grosso earned his doctorate in philosophy from Columbia University. He is an independent scholar associated with an ongoing seminar at the Esalen Institute on the role of mind in the cosmos. He has taught humanities and philosophy at Marymount Manhattan College, at City University of New York, Kennedy University in California, and City University of New Jersey. He is the author of several books, including Soul Making, Uncommon Paths to Self-Understanding, The Man Who Could Fly, St. Joseph of Cupertino and the Mystery of Levitation, and The Smile of the Universe, Miracles in an Age of Disbelief. He joins me today to discuss his latest work, Yoga of Sound, The Life and Teachings of the Celestial Songman, Swami Nada Brahmananda. Michael, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
How you doing? Glad to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm doing good, and I'm really happy that you're here with me too. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. As I said to you in email messages, I really enjoyed the Yoga of Sound, and I also read The Smile of the Universe, and I think that we have a lot to talk about.
All right.
I enjoyed them very much. So I thought that we would begin with the Yoga of Sound and Swami Nada Brahmananda. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about who he was. And I'm also interested in what led you to taking lessons with him.
Okay. Well, back in the late 1970s, I was living in New York City at that time, and I had a friend who told me about an unusual musician in town who was teaching a rare form of vibration yoga. And oddly enough, I should mention this right now, I had a dream about a week before of a musician in town whom I had never seen, a kind of a slightly oldish man who told me that he wanted to give me lessons, but there would be no instruments. And I thought that was paradoxical, but I forgot about it until I met Nada Brahmananda about a week or so later. And that turns out to be a theme that he repeatedly shared with me, that it's not really about the musician, it's not really about an instrument, that you can train yourself in the higher forms of music just with your own body, as it were, and your own consciousness, and it's beyond instrument, although we used instruments. So eventually I did meet him, and I stepped into, he had a little shabby office on 24th Street in Manhattan. part of the Shivananda Divine Center that were in charge. And so I remember the first moment when I knocked on, I said, "Come in." And he greeted me as though we had been friends for 100 years. It was a very warm opening. And what I had learned about him, impression, my correct account of him, that he was a master of this rare but virtually extinct yoga of vibrations, of sound vibrations. And his home was in Rishikesh, in the mountains there of India and Tibet. And he was inspired to travel around the world to try to convey his messages and his philosophy of music. And the thing that struck me, an immediate thing that struck me about him, apart from his warmth and his sweetness as a human being, was his emphasis on the fact that what he had to teach was pertinent in the age of Kali.
Mm.
And I didn't know at that point, I knew that Kali was a goddess and a Hindu goddess, but there's a different Kali. And what he was talking about was the age of conflict.
Mm.
And since then, I've done some research, and that's correct. So the idea is that this is a form of music that can touch us in a way that deeply changes us and enhances our inwardness and spirituality. So I was just totally open to that idea. But oddly enough, that was about, well, more than 20 years ago now, right?
Mm.
Yeah, considerably. 20 years is what I've been living where I am, and that's the number that jumped in. It's almost 50 years, right?
Yeah.
And since that time, the age of Kali has been more Kali-esque, I would say. And more than ever, we could use a philosophy that emphasizes harmony as opposed to conflict. So
Right.
that was my introduction to Swami, not a Brahmananda. And everyone tended to call him Nada, which itself is an amazing name or word. It actually means the fire of the intellect.
Mm.
It's a strange thing, but it's also a word that refers to the spiritual sounds that tune us into the divine consciousness. So it's a complicated word, and it's also his name.
Yeah.
And not a Brahmananda, he used to say, I'm the guy that makes you happy through music. That was his name, essentially, which is not something we normally do in the Western world, right?
Right.
So anyway, that was my intro to Nada.
Okay. So one of the questions I had, and you might have just answered it, but given that you had this experience with Nada 50 years ago, I was curious, why write this book now? Because you've got, all these
Good
other
question.
books. And,
Right.
is it because of the Kali Yuga? What led
Partly.
you to write it now?
Well, here's the thing. Since I've been, like many of us, isolated in this period of the plague, I happen now to live by myself. And I have a lot of material in my house that I've accumulated, books and papers. And it's amazing, especially the last 20 years that I moved here and have been living by myself. I've written a great deal. And so I'm constantly and collected all kinds of books. I'm constantly being surprised and entertained by my own house, things I find in my house. So I stumbled upon the material that I wrote about Nada Brahmananda, and I started to read it. I have to say, by the way, that while I've been here, once or twice I did look, and I actually started to play around with it, even though I had the notes from way back. But as I read it, I said to myself, this really is pertinent now, particularly now, and I'm going to see if I can get the book published. And Nick, I have to tell you, ironically, I got a contract for this book in one day.
Wow.
I called a friend and said, do you know that's an agent that possibly, and she turned me on to Richard Grossinger, who's himself an author, a brilliant author, written millions of books.
Yeah.
And in the first day, he just looked at it. He says, you can count on this.
Yeah.
And so I had the book that is sold. But now, the funny thing is, it's taken almost 3 years for it to come out. I mean, in other words, they published a lot of books. They're a good publishing house. They're very systematic, but everything is very slow.
Mm.
So, well, maybe the timing is even better now. Who knows? But the book is out, and that's how I came to write it so late. Oddly enough, I'll add this since you asked me the question. Earlier in the 1970s, I wrote another book, which I had neglected and almost forgotten, about an extraordinary student I had who was psychically off the charts and strange. And I have the whole story down. I have her diary. I have all kinds of material about her, which I had that I really sort of neglected. And so I've started to look at that, and guess what? I'm writing a novel I decided to make it a novel rather than an essay, a scholarly essay. And I've written about 150 pages so far. So I hope I don't keep finding books I have to publish that I wrote a long time ago. But anyway, so that's an additional point I thought I would share. I hope this novel I'm writing will be of interest, because it's all about a young woman with psychic abilities who was attacked by everybody in her family, her boyfriend, the schools. It's a story that people, I think, will be interested in. That's why I wanted to make it more dramatic, a true story where I've changed the names and the locale. So that's what's up there.
Wow.
That would be one of the next things I'm working on.
Okay. Have you written any novels before? The list of books that I read or saw were, I thought, mostly nonfiction, but you have written novels before?
I have written. Yeah, I have written a novel, which I'm looking for a publisher now.
Okay.
It's an epistolary novel about disgruntled men, probably out of tune with all the call for women's rights. I understand that, and I'm a rabid feminist. But nevertheless, I have this book, which I think is sort of funny and perhaps illustrative of something that's going on in the culture, about disgruntled men. It's called Letters of, I've forgotten the title, but anyway. So yeah, that was and I keep finding I have a book of poetry I want to publish. I have, for a while I've been living here in Charlottesville, been writing plays. I mean, I've published some of them, but to do these things, you have to be in the world of the playwright, in the world of the poet, which I'm not. I'm in more sort of academic world of research on consciousness. But I'm trying to get all the stuff I've done out there. And I'm also a painter, but that's my personal sadhana, my spiritual practice. I don't worry about recognition there. Right. Although sometimes I think I'm good enough to get recognized. Anyway, that's that part.
Yeah. Well, a very creative life, and that's amazing. And
either that or I go crazy by myself, right? I mean, I got nothing to do but do things.
Yeah, I can relate. I'm also kind of curious, given the work that you have focused on in your career, especially, with consciousness, how much of an influence, if any, was Nada on the development of your thought towards that end?
Well, not much, because it was an independent process. What got me into the research on the paranormal was the fact that I had experiences from my early boyhood and periodically have had, I don't call myself a psychic, but I have had and witnessed, because of my research, lots of strange stuff. Lots. When I say lots, I mean lots. And so I remember in graduate school mentioning casually that I had an ESP experience to one of my fellow buddies, and he looked at me astonished and he said, "But that's impossible. That would imply dualism." And so I just looked at him. I said it wasn't possible. I said it's a fact. And it was that I remember that event. I was still only a graduate student, but in the back of my mind, I was already on the way toward having a somewhat independent point of view about the nature of mind. because I was surrounded by reductionists and materialists. And I personally could not and would not swallow that based on my own experience. I mean, it's not, and then I got to reading, and there's mountains of literature on this subject. So, yeah, that's how I got into the research on the paranormal.
Okay. Yeah, and I appreciate that and can resonate with it quite a bit. And it's interesting to me because in philosophy, the ongoing paradigm really does seem to be that reductive materialism.
Pretty
And
much, yeah.
and there is this automatic rejection of anything kind of paranormal. And I think that is much to the detriment of academic philosophy.
Well, I think so too. The simple reason that it's false.
Right.
I mean, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that indicates, implies that we cannot explain many of our experiences. We can't explain the very fact that we're conscious. And that, I'm sure you're aware of that fact, that even the most rabid, reductive materialists admit, like a guy named Steven Pinker. I like him. He's he's a reductive materialist, but he admits we haven't got a clue to how to explain consciousness. Why? Because it's just totally different from anything physical. I mean, all you need to do is observe yourself to realize that. And yet the philosophers assume, even though they know there's a problem explaining consciousness, they are addicted to what we call promissory materialism. Eventually, we'll figure it out. I don't think so. It's not going to happen. But so I have had that from my early years there, a tendency to be outside the mainstream. And here I am talking to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's challenging, I think, for philosophers. You know, it's probably challenging and rewarding to be independent in that way. And I think it's necessary. And I imagine that you might agree with this, but it seems to me that when we talk about, you know, in science, and I think that this applies to philosophy as well, that there are paradigms that they operate within. And, you know, philosophy and science share quite a bit in that reductive materialism.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that the model of shifting paradigms is usually predicated on some kind of anomaly that the current paradigm can't answer. And I've been thinking quite a while now that consciousness is the anomaly that the old paradigm can't answer. And if we don't address it one way or the other or explore it, we're going to stay stuck in a paradigm that doesn't work.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's you can't do philosophy or science without your consciousness.
Yeah.
And you can't explain consciousness. So, get with it. Face the problem.
Yeah, for sure. And you begin the book, actually, you mentioned the dream, but you also had another experience that you began the book with that led you to begin discussing the music of transcendence. And you said that the book is about this music of transcendence. And I was wondering if maybe you could discuss what that means. What is the music of transcendence?
Okay, I'm not sure what the second point is that you're saying that you're alluding to, but I can try to answer the question about your question right now.
All right.
Yeah, what I meant was after studying with Brahmananda, I realized that he realized I was not going to become an Indian musician. But his philosophy of music was not just about music. It was about life and about our relationship to the world around us and the transcendent, the higher invisible realms of spirituality. And that the notion of harmony could be generalized. If music is about harmony, there are deeper forms of harmony that are not musical. I mean, as a painter, I'm constantly I feel like I'm making visual music when I work on a painting. I see colors and there are patterns and there are balance. It's just like music. And to carry that point further, everything that we experience, in a sense, is an attempt to work with the elements available. It could be a personality. It could be any kind of a job that you have to perform. There's the elements of music, of harmony, of tuning in. All these metaphors really come to life. The musical metaphors come to life very easily when you apply them to the business of everyday living. It could be anything. It could be cooking. I mean, you have to cook and get things taste harmonizing, balancing each other. In relationships, it's the same thing. If someone's too talkative, okay, it's like too many flats in the stream of music, as it were. So the elements that we're working with in life are analogous to the elements that we work in with music. And so that's the metaphor that I extend from learning music. And to learn music, you have to concentrate, tune in to yourself. But you can carry that process further into many branches of your life, and all branches of your life. You can be always hunting for just the right note, as it were, in a relationship with a person. So I can go on illustrating what I mean. I think, especially in light of this Kali notion of conflict, jarring discontinuities in human relationships and human situations, and the biggest discontinuity and lack of harmony in our world today is the lack of harmony between human behavior and the planet that we inhabit. So I take this business of the climate crisis as a challenge to our terrestrial sense of the harmony that we human beings, the average human being, is clueless as to how much he or she is dependent on the natural world around us, the food, the air, the water. I've been listening lately to stories about the garbage heap that's turning into oceans, or the oceans that are turning into garbage. Right. It's very, very depressing and disturbing. So I see the challenge of the Nada Brahmananda posed with his particular art form and his emphasis on vibrations as generalizable in a very, I think, hopefully meaningful way, at least to me and to others, if I can get them to think about it. And so, yeah, that would be my response to that question.
Yeah, well, in regards to the climate emergency, it seems to be an absolute reflection of not just that we are out of harmony with the natural world, but we are also disharmonious with ourselves, that it reflects our own imbalance.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you see that in so many different ways. I mean, I mean, now, yesterday I was reading about the leading cause of death of children and teenagers are related to the internet encounter. I mean, that's a staggering thought. I mean, these kids get totally depressed and commit suicide. I mean, and all these hideous things we're hearing about in the news lately. You took a wrong step onto my property. I'm going to blow you away with an AR-15. That is so bizarre, so unspeakable. Yesterday, I read an account of the number of yearly deaths by guns in the United States. 47,000 approximately Americans. Think of that. 47,000 human beings die by gunshot in the USA. If that is not a shocking fact, that should wake everybody up, right? And say, hey, what the heck is going on? So yeah, I can't do any of my creative work anymore out of the context of what's happening to the planet as a whole. I can't. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not by myself anymore. We're all together as a species. And whether we know it or not, we got to get together and deal with this problem of being out of sync with the natural world. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah. Well, I recently, for a project that I'm working on, I recently looked up the exact number that you just cited for gun deaths in the
Mhm.
United States. And what's interesting is that 54% of those are actually suicides.
Yes.
And out of that number, it was something like 81 or 82% are men. And so
Uh-huh.
you mentioned, the men being disgruntled, that novel you were
Uh-huh.
working on. One of the things that I've been kind of been influencing a lot of my thought has been the quote from Thoreau that, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And if it seems to
Mhm.
me that that number of suicides, that's a crisis, that's, an epidemic, and that, men aren't happy, and there's a lack of happiness, it seems, because I don't think that so many people would go around killing themselves or killing other people if we were happy and harmonious.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That fact, I was aware of the large numbers of men committing suicide. And I have to say that the suicide, a lot of the problems, I almost everything I can tune into for myself. That's how I understand. But I have to admit that maybe I'm just being naive to say this. I have never, for a split second, thought of offing myself.
Mm.
I mean, so it's remote from that modality of mind where somebody can have such thoughts. And so maybe I'm lucky. I've had
Yeah.
a nice family, poor but nice, good, loving family, and I grew up feeling okay about myself. And I mean, not so. Yeah, it's shocking the
Yeah.
business about all these men
Yeah.
committing.
Right. And so let's try to get back to the book here for a little bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so Nada taught about vibrations, and there were a couple of sort of key themes that I found in the book. And one of them is counting, this kind of rhythmic pattern. And I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit, because when I was reading, I have a little note here to the side where I was seeing it as being somewhat similar to being in the flow of the Tao, in a sense, being
Mhm.
in synchronicity with, or being synchronous, being in the flow with the rhythms and the patterns of all of being.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, no, that's certainly one way of looking at it. And in terms of nada, the emphasis on counting is the central thing there is counting is a form of mind control.
Mm.
The first thing that Nana Brahmananda said to me when I stepped into his room after he said, "Welcome," he looked at me and he said, "Mind control is
Mm.
life. Rhythm is music." That was it. I mean, that was his whole philosophy. So the emphasis on counting is twofold. On the one hand, you have to focus your mind to count in music, but it's not just an abstract, sort of lazy, meandering mathematical counting. It's a physical, bodily counting where your body comes into play. And see, music can move us in ways, we know that, right? We all know that music can move us in ways that words or even painting, purely visual. Music grabs your body, you can feel it. And so, on the one hand, you have this pursuit of mind control. I mean, in the case of Nada Brahmananda, it's far out. But any art form or any intellectual skill or any moral endeavor that's challenging requires that you be focused, that your mind stays in one place and doesn't get blown apart and the energy is scattered in all directions. So so the first thing is the role of counting is that is the instrument of mind control.
Mm.
And in addition, it's with music because it's physically transformative. By the way, the Renaissance philosophers of music had the same idea. Ficino, for example, was one of the great Renaissance philosophers. Music was absolutely, I mean, I have that. I had some discussion of that in the book, that and he makes the point about music taking possession of the body. And a lot of the Renaissance music, Monteverdi, for example, I was just listening to him on Sundays here in Charlottesville. They have a wonderful day of music, and they have a lot of early music. And they had the whole morning, I think, was on Monteverdi. And I have to say, it just spaces me out. It's just beautiful music. And but again, music moves us emotionally, but we also, in making music or listening to music, we are moved. But in making music and making the music of our lives, we have to be mentally alert, focused, and relentless in our efforts. And so that would be, I think, the best way I could reply to your last question.
Okay. So the counting is kind of like a meditation then.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
And
meditation with an impact on your body.
okay.
That's you see.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it seems to me that there is this idea often that meditation is just the mind, but I also know, like in Buddhism, there are, you engage in body scans and whatnot. So it's also an embodied practice. And it seems like that's what Nada was teaching, a kind of embodied meditation then.
Very much so.
Right.
Very much so.
And it seems to me that the reason to do this is because we are not in control of our minds in so many ways. And it seems like that reflects that imbalance, right? That we're all in right now.
Well, we can't help it. Our minds are open, and there are internal distractions. I feel hungry, I feel horny, I feel anxious, right? That's coming from the body. And then there's stuff outside that, the horns beeping, the bombs dropping if you're in the wrong place. I'm exaggerating here for us, but at any rate. But so inner and outer, we're being bombarded at all times by good stuff, sometimes beautiful blue sky. It's not blue right now, it's all gray. And so in a certain sense, we're kind of forced to assume the role of our minds handling that, the basic chaos of human experience, especially in the highly chaotic modern world of 2023. It's for sure very.
Yeah, you noted that Nada never worried. And I have a quote here that
Right.
maybe we can discuss. It says, Nada never worried. To worry is to tire yourself, to consume the precious energy of spirit. Why do we worry? This may be the original sin. We forget the gap between what we think and what there is. And I like that we're just passengers in the car of destiny, and God is driving. Regardless of whatever happens is necessary part. Oh, regard whatever happens is the necessary part of your journey. And I can relate to that about the worrying, because the worrying is, you wrote, and Nada said, there's no point in worrying, but yet our minds are constantly, the energy of the mind is constantly absorbed by worrying.
Right.
And so is the solution to that, you noted, that God's driving. So is it surrender?
Yeah, well, I think I remember that exchange with Nada, and I reviewed it in the book this afternoon. And the secret of never getting tired,
Right,
is, well, you got it right, not to worry, but you don't worry if you are truly in tune with the divine element of your experience. And there are a number of Christian classics on that subject. There's a book called Abandonment to Divine Providence that a Jewish friend of mine turned me on to. And she was nuts about this book. And I read it myself. It's a beautiful piece of psychology back in the 18th century about never worrying, just exactly like Nada Brahmananda, leave it to the divine plan. Trust. You have to have an element of trust. And so it's a very good lesson. I mean, with all those distractions and all the worries that bombard us from all directions, my conclusion is we need some kind of spiritual practice. You know, I hesitate to use the word spiritual, but I like the Indian expression sadhana. I don't even know exactly what it means, but it's a spiritual practice. And whether it be music or anything that can occupy your mind and concentrate your mind. And the other thing that I think is necessary for sadhana is the practice has to improve you. You have to feel yourself getting better or not. Then you can say, okay, I have to do more, I have to get more alert and so forth. But I don't think that's a strange idea, but it's an idea that our sort of distracted culture, which is more and more secular and out of tune, mostly or much out of tune with, let's say, a higher dimension of reality, never occurs to people that they can take control of their inner reality and shape their lives. And but so that's one of the aims that I've tried to do in the book. I want to remind people that, and you don't have to be, it doesn't have to be fancy, or it could be anything, whatever it is that you love and that you can explore and get into. It could be just whatever your job, just your everyday job, whatever it is. Do it with spirit and with a deliberateness. And then if you have an art form, so much the better. And music, of course, is one of the great ways of doing it, but not for entertainment and not for making money. I mean, that may happen, but that's apart from the sadhana function,
right,
of the arts and music in particular.
Yeah, one of the takeaways that I got from the book was to live your life as a spiritual practice, to live your life as the sadhana.
Yeah, I think whenever I think about that, it makes sense, and I can do something. I can apply it. I'll just take a deep breath sometimes and realize that's one of the most powerful things to cope with emotions and to get focused mentally. Breathing. I'm trying to think. Jacobson has written. I've forgotten his first name. Wonderful book on relaxation. And it's all about learning how to relax you. And you don't have to do anything. You take drugs. You just mentally, I mean, as Jacobson points out, to relax your right arm could take a half hour if you do it the right way. And if you're having difficulty sleeping, as I did for a while, I really got into Jacobson's book on relaxation. So and of course that is therapy, but it also has a spiritual dimension.
Right.
Because it's the same process. You're trying to open yourself up to your better angels.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what I personally struggle with is I try to be in alignment with, the spirit, with God, whatever you want to call it. But this is the mind, but it's always these questions, especially when it comes to making choices. And I think we often second guess ourselves, and we often second guess. It seems to me that it's more of a feeling that we should follow, being in tune with ourselves in order to have that surrender that's required to experience this lack of worry and move us forward in the ways that we need to be moving forward.
Absolutely. The word, I think one of the keys is the word faith immediately gives you a religious overtones, but the New Testament Greek word for faith, pistis, is different. Faith implies some doctrine. I believe in some doctrine. It implies that. Pistis, in the sense of trust, is more an emotional thing. I trust my friends. When I was a boy, I trusted my mom and my dad, you see. That kind of trust, where you surrender the autonomy and the rigidity of your ego to a benign force and allow yourself to be guided. And that kind of openness and trust and belief is what can be such a powerful inducer of the creative energies of the personality, that they're all waiting there. I'm convinced that there's treasures, latent treasures in all of us, but we need it's a mystery how to unleash it.
Right.
It's so unpredictable. It can happen in the strangest ways. I have in one of those books an account of in the not a Brahmananda book, music book. I have a story of a guy that I've never forgotten. I don't know who he is, but written up. He was just an ordinary guy in the middle of a job, just working, moving some packages around. And he suddenly, this light came over him, and he was immersed in the most fantastic music and blissful feelings. And it doesn't say how long it lasted, but it was like an invasion of the transcendent suddenly in the midst of the most ordinary thing, everyday happening. I love stories like that because who the hell knows why it happened to him, right? We can't say, but it does open the gates, as it were, and suggests that almost anything might trigger a wave of enlightenment, you see. And that's a nice thought to have that kind of general pistis or trust that the universe is benign enough to look out for me in the end. And I don't think that's a bad way of seeing things.
Yeah, that's always fascinated me. I remember I first started thinking about that when I read Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, because that's what he would do often. And he just had this trust that, I think for him, a lot of the focus was on the goddess, probably Kali, but that she would provide. He didn't worry about where his next meal came from. He had trust that it would come, that it would be provided. And I have I have one friend in particular who's very deeply Christian, who does much the same, and I liked the idea that you noted in the book that it's, I like the pistis, that it's trust rather than dogma.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. It makes it more human and less mechanical.
Yeah. And it seems like that when we think in terms of the pistis, as or knowledge as dogma, that leads us to this kind of literal mindedness, when we focus on dogma. And I know that you noted, and I think that maybe Nada noted this too. I'm trying to find the exact quote here, but that this literal mindedness is deeply, deeply problematic. Yeah, it's the enemy of the active power of imagination, is what you wrote.
Yeah, very much so. The literal minded, it's. I mean, there's where, nowadays you hear a lot about the humanities. I mean, I've quit teaching about 20 years ago, early, by the way, to get the hell out. I mean, I liked it, but I want to. But and I got out just at a point where things were getting more obnoxious and more insistent, and I remember being dragged off to meetings and to listen to people tell me how I should treat women. I know how to treat women. I grew up in a family, two sisters, a mother, smart aunts. They're all tough ladies. You don't mess around with them, and I love them. I know how to. I don't need to be told how to relate to basic. I learned that. I mean, I was raised in a decent family. So, and it was getting very obnoxious in the academic environment. So I was happy to leave. And on the other hand, some people do need to be instructed in the elements of decent living.
Yeah,
so I'll grant that.
Yeah, and academia has only gotten way more toxic. I am currently trying to get the hell out myself.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh yeah. It's that's a whole other discussion.
All right, I won't ask you any questions.
Yeah, no, it's become very dehumanizing, I think.
Well, that was the sense I was getting, and I was glad to leave.
Yeah. And I find, just to look at philosophy a little bit, I find that some of it is more in terms of indoctrination, especially I teach some of the classes I teach, logic and critical thinking. And one of the things that I'm supposed to do is address pseudoscience, quote unquote
Uh-huh.
pseudoscience. And in the
Okay.
books, it's always interesting because it'll go through things like ESP and it just flatly says there's no evidence. And I'm like, but there is. How can I, in good conscience, stand there in front of these students and just say, this is garbage when I know it's not? And
Exactly.
it's frustrating. It seems like in philosophy where there should be open inquiry and investigation and things, that
Uh,
even there it's kind of indoctrination,
yeah.
which is
Yeah.
sad.
When I was a teacher, I taught for a while a course, Psychic Phenomena and the Nature of Man. That dates me, right? That's too, I wouldn't phrase it like that now. I would say, and humans. But
Right.
anyway, that course was so popular that we had 3 sections of it going. I taught 2, and another teacher took on who was interested. And then after, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, they changed the rules and it was no longer a course that could be taken. But I tell you, I learned so much from my students,
Mm.
and I hope I, taught them a few things too. But it was wonderful teaching those courses. And I mean, I had a student who told me that she could go out of her body, and I challenged her to do it, and visit me. And I won't go into this in detail but she did stuff like that, and she moved my furniture around,
Wow.
and I didn't know, and I noticed it in the morning, and then she called me up and said, I was there and I moved it, and I knew that no one was in the house but me.
Mm.
So stuff like that, my students were my teachers, and but then I had students that took the course and they told me, my psychology professor told me that if I take your course, it's going to ruin my life. I said, well, let's.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So,
kind of a badge of honor in a sense, right? I would be like,
right,
yeah, come on in.
right.
Uh, yeah, I don't know if anyone's ever said that. It's with academia now, the reliance is on adjuncts, and we don't really, for the most
Mhm.
part, we don't get to create the courses that we would really like to teach, and which is a
Really?
shame because
Yeah,
it's such a
yeah,
waste of talent.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
remember reading, I forget who it was another book months ago, but the author made the same kind of claim that they've been teaching a class at their university that's on like the paranormal or something. And they're like, it fills up immediately.
Mhm.
And students have an interest in these things.
Oh, yeah.
But instead, I have to stand there. I'm supposed to stand there and say, oh, no, it's not true.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, which is unfortunate. And I don't do it. I fight back. I'm like, no, the book says this, but no, no, no. It seems that there is also in the book another theme and that I wanted to ask you about, to go back to everything in terms of counting, this notion of coming correct.
all right, right.
And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit. What did Nada mean by that, coming correct?
Well, I have to say that that was a funny kind of expression because coming has this sexual connotation, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think he was aware of that because
Mm,
he could, well, his English was not that evolved, but he always used it in a way that they used it constantly. You come correct in conversation. You come correct. If I did something correctly, played correctly, all he meant by coming correctly is literally that the music, the rhythms, the count was all right, you see.
mm,
But then he generalized that phrase to include all kinds of encounters, which could be described as, in his odd little English, coming correct or not coming correct.
mm.
But I always enjoyed it because of its quiet, subtle, and amusing associations, which he probably didn't have,
Right,
but
right.
I did, and I assume my readers
Mm,
get that little tickling sensation
right,
of what the heck's he
right.
talking about coming correct. But
Yeah.
I doubt if Nara Brahmananda ever came, period. I mean, he physically was very strange. I mean,
Right.
his 2 hours a night sleep,
Mm,
and never ill a day in his life,
mm.
died at 97, all kinds of weird physical things. He could hold his breath for 35 minutes and was tested in a scientist in India for that, the reality of that. So he was an unusual man.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of unusual abilities that are reported in especially in the Indian religious traditions.
Oh, yeah.
You discuss those a little bit, the siddhis, right? These are the
Right,
powers that come out of yoga practice. I know that Patanjali talks about them in the Yoga Sutras. And
right,
so being
right.
able to hold the breath for like 35 minutes, that would be a siddhi, right?
Yeah, oh, for sure. Oh, yeah, that's what I describe in the book. There's a chapter that he spent 108 days buried underground and practicing to his nada kumbhaka,
Hmm.
his ability to play the tabla for long periods of time on a single breath. So he worked at that, and then of course his diet. I mean, and the other odd thing about Nada, he only slept 2 hours a night. I think I mentioned that already.
Yeah, yeah.
That's pretty interesting, and never got tired. I mean,
Right.
that's maybe maybe exaggerate a little bit about his own self, but on balance, and all the people that cite him, and he was quite famous in India
Mm.
before he came to America. Then he went back soon after and lived another 18 years or something
Mm.
after, because he was 80 when I met him.
Right.
And
Yeah.
97 or 98, whatever it was.
Yeah. You also wrote that he didn't dream, that he was tested and he
That was the
didn't
other
dream.
oddity. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They had him 3 nights, he told me, in a brain dream laboratory. And they were just like, this guy doesn't, there's no sign of dreaming.
Mm.
And of course, he only slept a couple of hours. And so that's a bit of a mystery. Well, yeah, it is a mystery how you get away without dreaming.
Right.
I don't dream much anymore, it seems, partly because it's legal now. I guess I can say that smoke weed,
Hmm.
and it definitely reduces the REM sleep.
Right.
It doesn't reduce the sleep. I sleep soundly. I go right through without dreams.
Mm.
If I don't smoke, then I'll dream, and I'll often have striking dreams. But so, not dreaming. I don't know what he was smoking. Nothing
Yeah.
as far as I can make
Yeah. Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I've always assumed that the dreaming with cannabis is that and I could be wrong, but it affects the short-term memory, that you just can't recall the dreams. It may not be that you don't, but that you can't recall them. That's kind of my intuition.
Oh,
Um,
that's interesting. That- But actually, interesting dream life on the whole.
yeah.
But on the other hand, I sleep soundly
Yeah.
and without dreams. If I've been happen to have been smoking a little bit, and the uninterrupted dreams, I wake up, I feel fine, and
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going crazy yet.
Right. Yeah. Well, I like the observation that you made in the book in terms of him not dreaming. And this was just, I guess, a possible explanation, was that maybe he didn't dream because he went through his entire life, or this reality, as if it were a dream. And that
Well,
if you,
yes,
yeah,
yes. I mean, there were times when I would be walking along with him, which we did occasionally go for walks together, and he'd look up at the sky, or if it was in Manhattan, he'd look around at all of he says, it's like a movie, he said. It's unreal. He had this sense of the unreality of everything. And therefore, it didn't perturb him or disturb him in any way, because it's just a strange dream. And blithely unaware of danger. I mean, I remember this part of the book I described how we were out on a country road, and he liked to walk right in the middle of the road on the yellow line. And I kept telling him, that's not a good place because I'm walking on the side. Cars can come shooting over a hill. And when they did, he just dove away, got out of the way. But he just wasn't afraid of anything.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I just reviewed that this morning because I remember you asked him, well, what happens if you've got a car coming from each direction? And his
Right.
response was,
Right.
never going to happen.
When it happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He seemed like a really interesting person, very fun. I liked the all the encounters that you described in there. One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit, I suppose, is this. You referred to it a little bit ago, the Nada Kumbhaka, which
mhm.
was a kind of, I guess it's the meditation that he practiced, where he focused on this icon of the god Shiva.
Right. Right.
And you tell a really interesting story about that icon. And I was wondering if you might be able to share that and then talk a little bit about his practice. And
Right. Well, the icon, as he recounted it to me, was given to him after he had made a presentation, an outdoor presentation somewhere. I don't know where, I don't forget where it was. And a man, an elderly man, came up to him and blessed him and gave him this Shiva icon. And Nada looked looked at it, and then looked up, and he was gone. And he asked people, he did a sensible thing. He asked people around him, did you see an old man get? No, nobody saw anything. So that's the story he told me. And now he used that in a practice after he had mastered the basics of Nada Kumbhaka, which is this prolonged tabla playing on single breath where he stops breathing. He calls it his death body because his body is like dead. He's not breathing anymore. And but of course he's not dead. He's got oxygen in him. But at any rate, he told me that he slept 2 hours a night, and he would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he would then do Nada Kumbhaka. He would then take a breath. I mean, after I don't know if he had breakfast or what, but he would take a breath and, as a meditation, play all these complicated riffs on the two drums on the tabla, and he would do it. According to him, for 35 minutes, and then that would be his morning meditation. And but he had to learn how to do that, and that's when he had this 108 days, which I mentioned earlier, of solitude underground there practicing. But he had to learn how to do that. He built up to it gradually. I asked him, I said, how the heck did you do that? Practice. And I was talking about this to a colleague of mine recently, that I've been practicing doing things that are physical things that I maybe couldn't do before because I was just thinking about it, but what practice can do. For example, balancing myself on one foot. Now, as you get older, which I'm getting older, and they say you got to do that now to prove that you're balanced. Well, not only can I do it, I've learned, but with practice, I can hop around, I can swing my other leg, I can make all kinds. So the more I practice at it, I can do stuff that I'm pretty sure the average person, I should say, is not likely to do. And just simply the result of practice. And one of the things that I've learned from Nada, maybe indirectly, because he never said this, but is to exercise my body in a way that I'm stretching the tendons, not just muscles. I don't have much in the way of muscles, but I don't have any extra meat on me, but I have some muscle. But that's not the most important thing. It's flexibility. And so I've been learning how to do movements of my body that I'm not accustomed to doing. And I feel so much better. And so anyway, that's just one of the byproducts of my study with Nada Brahmananda. It's not just mental meditation; it's a psychophysical process.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's so important because we need to harmonize mind and body. And I think that in our Western culture, we tend to, focus more just on the mind aspect and ignore the body, to its
Right,
detriment,
right.
ignore its importance. you
Yeah.
know what I found interesting was also in regards to his meditation was the focus that was
Oh,
required.
right. You're right. I didn't mention that part. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he would keep his eye on. So there's another way of focusing, right? You're looking at it, you're focusing on one point, you're holding your breath, and you're doing all these complicated movements with the drum. That's a totally absorbing activity, right? And it's bound to have a good effect because all your energies, all your functions are together. And yeah, that's I admire all of that and try to apply it in one way or another, to myself. That
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
challenge.
Yeah, and that is the challenge, and it's something I've been kind of thinking about myself a lot lately in terms of, going through this life is especially in the environment that we live in now with technology everywhere. It
Mhm.
feels like so many people now just by default have a kind of distraction. It's a OCD that we all have attention ADD, attention deficit disorder, that we're not
Yeah, yeah,
focused. And
absolutely.
uh,
Yeah,
yeah, and that if
challenge.
you
I
want,
mean, the phone here is, beeping. I try to keep it off, keep it out of sight if I'm concentrating on something, right? Because you never know. It starts beeping, and half the time it's worthless.
yeah.
Sometimes it's important. And
Mm.
I'm sorry, I kind of cut you off there. I didn't mean to.
No, no, no. I was just kind of riffing on this idea of how we're so distracted and unfocused, and
Yeah,
we so desperately need to be focused. And that
yeah.
it seems like as a kind of a philosophy of how to live, that, the message is to be focused, to be embodied, and to kind of surrender to that something larger in order to be
Well said.
to find that harmony, to find the harmony.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And what I like though, and this was the interest, you said you took a picture of that Shiva icon and that the icon, it was blurry as if it were
Yeah.
moving.
Yes, I wish I had saved that photograph. I might even still have it somewhere. I got tons of stuff, but I remember it. I was quite struck by it. So yeah, undoubtedly there are truly strange things that go on in our world. If you want to switch over maybe to say a little bit about that other book that I wrote.
Yeah,
Uh,
the Smile of the Universe.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Smile. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And it's I liked the connection of you go to the Sanskrit root for smile and miracle.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, the word there's the etymology of miracle. I was surprised. SMI goes back to the Sanskrit where we get the word smile.
Mhm.
So I decided on that title, and
Yeah.
which is kind of a neat idea. I like to ask myself, well, people, has the universe smiled at you lately?
Yeah. Well, and what would count as a miracle? We don't hear about them too often, but
Right.
are miracles still happening? Or are there?
Oh, right. There's no doubt about it. Now, but yeah, I'd spent some time talking about how I use the word. The word miracle we tend to associate with religious phenomena, and that's too narrow for me. On the other hand, I don't want to, let's say, neglect the context of the use of the word miracle, but the way I use the term, the core meaning simply is extra physical.
Mm,
You can explain it. Now, on the other hand, every little bit of ESP you might have might not qualify as a miracle. I mean, I might, for example, the phone may ring and I'll think of someone I haven't heard of for the longest time, and it's him or her. Let's say call it telepathy or precog, but call it a miracle is overstating it. But it partakes of that as it were, the essential understanding of a miracle. The word miracle is usually used for something more spectacular, like levitation, like the inertia, the ability to go on for months or years without eating. These things are spectacular. And so I think I try to indicate that I'm kind of using the word loosely, and because technically, if you have a mental event, cognition that's unexplained, that there's no physical explanation for, it counts as something paranormal. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I use the word miracle because I cover a lot of explicitly known miracles in my book.
Right.
Not just the Christian, but the Indian, and wherever I see it. I mean, I'm very clear about that. I'm not promoting any one religion. Quite the contrary. I'm promoting them all or none of them. That's up to you, up to the person, you know.
Yeah, the last miracle I remember hearing about was many years ago, but it was the Ganesh statues that
Oh yeah,
seemed to
that was
be drinking
1995.
milk. Yeah.
Yes, that's a mind-blowing thing. I first of all, I watched that on BBC. I mentioned it in the book. A BBC reporter takes the milk in the cup and puts it near the statue, and the camera goes right on top of it, and I can see the milk is not spilling, it's literally disappearing. The BBC reporter, his mouth is open, he's completely staggered by that. So I witnessed it myself. I also had two Indian students, and they went to a church, or whatever you call it, a temple in where I think I was teaching in Jersey City at that time. And they both came back to me with detailed reports of what they experienced. And the one guy went on the line, I don't want to exaggerate, either twice or three times, just to prove to himself that it was real. And he wrote the whole thing up. I still have his written report of what he experienced. And then I looked it up, of course, online, and there were attempts to explain it away in the silliest, totally unconvincing way. And it went on, for one thing, for exactly one day. And then at the end of the day, it stopped. So the attempts to explain it away as the result of some kind of, I forget the term that they use, but that it with some kind of absorption, it just doesn't make any sense, because why would it happen just one day?
Right.
And then stop. And so yeah, that's a wonderful example of a global phenomenon that qualifies. It's inexplicable physically, and it seems to be associated with religion. Well, it is. Doesn't seem, it is. And Ganesh. But there are others. Since then, I think I mentioned one thing that I witnessed myself. Saint Irene, I had seen on the television a report. I was living in New York at that time, about a church with a statue of Saint Irene that was weeping. So I went with a friend of mine, actually a book publisher. And we went online and we saw, I could see the thing was leaking. And so could it have been some kind of con job? I don't believe that for one split second. No church officials are going to do stuff like that. They'd be pounded into smithereens if they even tried something like that. And I did speak with people there in charge, and they gave me the history that it had happened in the past. And usually when it happened, when the saint wept, it meant trouble. That makes sense, right? You're crying, there's some kind of a problem. And now I have made a study of these weeping statues and bleeding statues, and I can tell you that it's all over the world. It's been happening. And it has a long history. It goes back to the Middle Ages. I've tracked down cases to the Middle Ages. And it's a form of psychokinesis. I mean, it's a kind of a bland technical term to describe a complete mystery.
Right.
Another related type of miracle which is reported frequently and at great length in the life of Padre Pio, is the stigmata. unexplained bleeding phenomenon. So that's another example. In the 1970s, I think it would have been, she would have still been alive in Germany. No, it was early. It was during the Nazi era. There was a Catholic mystic by the name of Teresa Neumann, who simply stopped eating. The last 35 years of her life, she ate and drank nothing and eliminated nothing. So he was taken into in a test situation for 2 weeks, and every hour of the day and night observed. Never was she seen. And then her whole life, everyone in her family, she was not one of these mediums or saints who was sort of sickly and half dead and lying on their beds saying strange things and doing strange things. She was a sort of wholesome, healthy woman who participated in all kinds of public events. Nobody ever saw her drink or sneak into the toilet. So, I mean, these things are happening today in the modern world, all over the place, if you keep your eyes open and if you pay attention. So, yeah, lots of miracles going on. And I mean, the whole book.
Well, yeah, I found it fascinating and really thought-provoking. And it gets back to some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the restrictions that we place on the possible. And I like that one of the ways that you define miracles in that book, I think you wrote that it was signs of the revolutionary freedom of the possible. And
yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like the world is far more, or reality is far more, I guess maybe it goes back to that dreamlike aspect, because it seems like every now and then something occurs in what we would consider waking reality that should only happen in a dream, like a saint taking off in flight or the stigmata.
Right. Well, I actually have a theory of levitation, which I've discussed with some physicist friends of my time, since you mentioned dream. In a dream, we can fly, right? Have you ever had a flying dream?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a couple. They're beautiful. They're always, they feel good, right? Now, I'll just mention this in one sentence because I don't want to use up the time, but it is conceivable to me that one of the physicist friends I have talks about the possibility, he's interested in hyperspace, and different kinds of space can be compacted into one space. So, and with the properties of both spaces retained in the one space. So it is conceivable to me that, especially mystics who are evolving their bodies in strange ways psychophysically, get into a state where somehow their dream consciousness encompasses the space around them, not just in their minds, and during that ecstatic state, because you have to be in an altered, Joseph and all of the levitators, every last one of them, they're always in a deeply altered state of consciousness, ecstatic, meaning out of their normal mental space. And I think what happens is when your everyday mind vacates your brain, so to speak, there is room for things to happen, psychological and physical things to happen that are normally impossible because of the crowding effects of ordinary mental life. And the attention is focused, you see, on these things. So it's conceivable to me that by ecstatically getting out of yourself, you enter into a dream space that surrounds you, and in that space you actually are dreaming, and in that dream you can levitate. I haven't described that very well. I've done a better job of describing it, but that's the gist of it at any rate. Right. I don't know if it's true or not. It's just a speculation.
Well, yeah. What it kind of brings to mind for me is that I'll see if I can say this clearly.
Right, it's hard.
Is I think and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't read some of the other things that you've written. I want to. But one of the things that you have written about is, I think you call it mind at large, because we started by talking about how, we don't even know what consciousness is, or, to use the word mind interchangeably. And I've often the model that I like is that we're surrounded in consciousness, that it's not a product of our brain, but it's like that, I know this is an old metaphor now, but the old radio receiver or TV
Uh-huh.
receiver, that it's, we just change the channel a little bit, but
Right,
we're surrounded by mind, we're surrounded by consciousness.
right.
And when you were speaking, what came to my mind was that whenever I would make that assumption of consciousness and mind being around me, I was always assuming that it was like a similar to my waking consciousness. There was more, but we have different kinds of consciousness. We have dreaming consciousness.
Right,
And
right.
so it would maybe make sense that this greater mind, that if what's happening is kind of tuning into that greater mind, it's like tuning into the dream consciousness of the greater
Mhm.
mind.
Yeah.
Is that what you were getting at in terms of
Yes,
the?
definitely. And somehow that's why the people who came close to Joseph when he was levitating would get sucked into the levitation space. So they
Hmm,
went up with him.
wow.
Or a sheep. One time he grabs, because he loved animals, he grabs a sheep and the sheep goes up with him.
Hmm,
So the space right around him, it's as though, and then there are people watching all this. So they're not in his dream space. So somehow his dream space expands due to his ecstasy, that he's totally open, and this transformation of the dream space takes place, and up he goes. And from the point of view of waking reality, to see someone in a waking world that's observing, it looks, weird and miraculous. But that there may be ultimately a natural explanation for that, and
hmm,
that has to do with dreams.
yeah.
And so I have broached this with a couple of well, particularly with Bernard Carr. He's a British physicist interested in hyperspace, and he said it's coherent. It's a coherent idea, but we don't know if it's true.
Right.
We'd have to figure out a way to test it. I don't know how we could do that, but
Yeah.
uh,
Are you aware of any more recent claims of levitation? The only ones that I would know of are from India, and I've seen a lot of folks attempt to debunk that. And I think some of them probably do need to be debunked, but it seems like it's something that we don't hear about often anymore.
no, you don't about it too often. And I had a colleague, a religious scholar, shy about showing his interest in the paranormal, but he did a little study, and he found contemporary cases, and I did too, of the following type. Several examples of a person falling off a boat, and the falling, he suddenly slowed up just long enough that he was able to grab. This is the guy that wrote me, or called me, I should say. It was on the phone. He never wrote me as he promised to write up it. But he fell off a boat, and as he was falling, he suddenly it slowed up. And the people on the boat saw that, and they reached down, they grabbed him, and they pulled him up
Hmm,
and saved him. And it's an experience that he and people there, they never forgot, right?
right.
Because he was falling, and pretty much know how you fall when you fall. He didn't. So, and my colleague had the same similar stories, that the accidents, sudden accidents, people slow up, or they gravity suddenly goes easy on them and they can escape. But it's rare.
Yeah.
Admittedly, this is not something you can dig up. And but then again, all forms of genius are rare. How many times are you going to have a Mozart turn up on the scene?
Right.
or John Coltrane. And so extraordinary things are extraordinary, you know.
Right. Right.
So, you know, and again, we don't know what's happening. You
Right.
know, I don't know what's going on. And well, I know those little bits that I read in my own experience, which is microscopic.
Hmm.
It's a big world with lots of people and lots of things happening. Who knows what's
Yeah.
going on?
Well, I like the idea of being able to live in a miraculous world.
Yeah. Well, maybe the next life. I mean, is if there is a next life. Again, that's a topic that I've looked into, and it's very difficult to ignore all the evidence for life after death. I mean, I
Right.
myself have had experiences that were pretty compelling. I mean, I spent a night in a haunted house, was attacked by a ghost, physically attacked. I don't know if I have that in one of my books, but I know I've written about it somewhere. And no one is going to ever talk me out of believing in the reality of ghosts.
Right.
And this was a house, by the way, that 9 other people saw the ghost. So I was invited to spend the night in the house by the woman who lived there. And I thought, you know, nothing's going to happen. I was wrong.
Mm.
I had this incredible experience. I also had a dream once, not a dream. I was awake. Summer night, I couldn't dream. I couldn't sleep. That's what I couldn't do. And I look up and there's my dead grandmother right next to me. And she's looking at me and and next to her is a woman. I've never seen her before. I don't know who she is, but she's kind of beautiful. And she reminds me a little bit of my mom, who's alive, by the way. So after this experience, I, that afternoon, I called my mom and told her the story. And she says, come visit me. I was living in New York, so I just sort of go over the bridge to Queens, where my mom was living. She showed me a photograph of that I had never seen before of her mom, her grandmother, and her sister, and other people all in this picture. And I said, that's the woman I dreamt of last night.
Wow.
And her name was Katie. I'd never seen her before. But my mother told me this story when I was a little boy, an infant, just born. Her mom with her sister, the one that I saw in the apparition, came to visit to see me. They wanted to see me. But my mother was embarrassed by the broken down crib that she had for me. And she said, he's sleeping now, so let's leave him alone. And so I wonder, could it have been that, you know, grandma and her sister in the dead world said, oh, let's go visit Mike, see what the son of a gun looks like now that 32 years old or whatever I was when that happened.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but I picked a picture out of a dead person.
Wow.
Could have been lucky, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't swear for sure that I'm going to live after death,
Right.
but there's tons of evidence pointing in that direction. What are your feelings about that, Nick? Have any thoughts on?
I think that there is incredibly compelling evidence of reincarnation. And I can share this experience that I had. I'll say that I have lived in 2 apartments that were haunted.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one was the last one I was in Denver, and then the first apartment I had in Los Angeles. And that one was, the building was it had been a hotel back in the early part of the 20th century that got converted into apartments. It was really close to the La Brea tar pits. And I was not the only person to have experiences in that apartment or in that building. But the personal story, there's one that my aunt told. I'll just say this real quick. She had a similar experience to you where she had a dream. And in the dream, she walks into this room and there was a woman at the table and there were a few other people. And this woman just turned and looked at her and said, you're not supposed to be here yet. And that was like the end of the dream. And and my aunt was a little girl at the time, and she told her mom, my grandmother, and she asked my aunt to describe the woman. And she did. And my grandmother apparently got up and went into her bedroom and came out, and she had a locket, and she opened the locket and she's like, was this it? And my aunt's like, yes, that was the woman. And it was my grandmother's mother. And my grandmother's mother had died suddenly when my grandmother was, I think, 10 years old. So my
Mhm.
aunt had never seen her before.
Uh-huh.
And
Wow.
so, yeah, she had that similar experience. The one I'll share with you is actually with my grandfather. I was raised by my grandparents, and my grandfather died rather unexpectedly. He was taken to the hospital in the middle of the night. He had an abdominal aneurysm, and he was flown down to, this was in Ohio, he was flown down to Dayton Emergency where they were doing the operation. And I was awake when, they woke me up when the ambulance was coming, and I stayed at home. I was waiting. So I didn't know what was going on. At around 5:36 in the morning, I thought I'm going to try to go back to sleep for a little bit. So I did, and I had a dream that I was standing in the backyard of the house. And when I was really little, I would stand at the same spot waiting for my grandfather to come home in the evenings. And he drove this like red Ford pickup truck. And in the dream, all it was is I was standing in that spot where I used to as a little kid, and I saw my grandfather walk up to his truck, and he stopped and he looked at me and he waved, and he
Mhm.
got into his truck and drove off.
Hmm.
Now, I had that dream at approximately the time that he actually died.
Okay.
And no one can tell me that that was not my grandfather saying goodbye to
Right.
me. And I think he could, because I was asleep and in the right state of mind where that could happen.
Yeah. It sounds like a what they call crisis operations. The moment
Yeah.
of death
Yeah.
is when people often. The first time I heard about that was from my mom. My mom, again, how did I get into this stuff? You have experiences, but
Right.
my mother told me when I was quite young that she had a brother who was in a hospital at the other end of the town. My mother was living on East 12th Street in those early days of her life, and her brother was in the hospital, I don't know, 20 blocks away or something. But she was looking out the window on a hot day, not thinking of her brother, when suddenly he appeared to her left and passed right through her.
Mm.
And she felt a cold breeze as he passed through her. And an hour later or so, she heard that he had died in the hospital just at that time.
Wow.
It's a classic, so-called crisis apparition. So
Yeah.
it's as though, when you cut loose from your body, then you cut loose from space.
Yeah.
And you can, and then what drives things is the psychology,
Mhm.
the psychological relations, not the spatial, physical relations. So you show up at people that are close to you, and things like that happen. So yeah, I hang out here in Charlottesville with the guys that are doing all this research on near-death experience and reincarnation.
Right. Right.
So, but even before I came here, I was well acquainted with the literature
Mhm.
because, well, as I said, from my earliest years, I was turned on by experiences and I wanted to know more. And then when then I got this wake-up call from becoming a philosopher,
Right. Right.
being told it's impossible.
Yeah.
No, it's not impossible, buddy.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
it's refreshing that you've been able to maintain the wonder that is supposed to be inherent to philosophy, right?
yeah, well,
The
yeah,
art
good
of
point.
wonder.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's right. The philosopher, as Plato said, begins with
Huh.
wonder.
Right.
And so, yeah, I'm going to write a post on that. I'm going to dedicate it to you. You just
Oh,
put an idea in my head
oh, well,
that I
thank you.
really should, because sometimes I'm asking myself, what am I doing? Hey, I am a philosopher. My training
Right.
is in philosophy, and I love philosophy, and I love my
Mhm.
role as a philosopher. And the philosopher indeed is supposed to be somebody alert to the strange, wonderful, the puzzling, the mysterious. That's what gets thinking going, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, wow. Uh, anyway, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know I've taken quite a bit of your time. I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I am so grateful and appreciative of your time and the work that you do. And I am so very much looking forward to reading some more of your books. But let me ask you before I
Great.
let you go, you mentioned that you are working on a novel. Do you have anything else that you're working on or anything that's coming up?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I've written a 42-page paper on the dark side of the paranormal for
Mm,
one of the main journals.
hmm.
And in writing it, first of all, I haven't heard back from them about what they're going to do with it.
Mm.
But I've kind of decided that I want to expand it into a book.
Mm.
And the dark side of the paranormal seems like an interesting topic.
Yeah.
And there are all different ways in which so-called or paranormal can be problematic. So that's one thing that I'm into. And but I'll be quite honest with you, the thought that keeps coming back to me, and I touch on this in my writings, is that all of this research that's being done and my small contribution to it on the paranormal is telling us something about the next step in human evolution.
Mm.
And that's what I like to speculate upon.
Mm.
And I think that right now we're at a stage where we really need to evolve as a species to cope with this climate crisis. We need people everywhere need to change. If not, we're in trouble. I mean, we're already in trouble.
Right.
But you know the story. I don't have to recount that to you. So that's one of my main preoccupations, is to try to convey the idea to people that we're in the midst of a critical moment in the history of our species. It's an exciting moment, a terrible, frightening one for many. Me too. I almost had my house blown to shit in a tree that came down within inches, smashing me and my house to smithereens. So it's a strange time to be alive, but it's also wonderfully exciting and challenging.
Yeah.
And we've got hints from the whole of history about the human potential to evolve into a more civilized, beautiful, creative species. And so that's something I'll be thinking about and writing about in the near future.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. Well, I hope we do.
Yeah.
I try to have hope.
Yeah, we're entitled to hope, right?
Yeah.
You can't take that away from us, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
But
Nick, it's been a pleasure, point of view, talking with you. We finally got to it, and
yeah.
so stay in touch if you if you're inclined.
Yeah, I
Share,
would like that. Yeah.
right, and I might do the same.
Yeah, yeah, please do. Please do. And one last thing, do you have a website for people to go to? Where can people find
Yeah,
out more about you?
yeah, I do have a website. It's consciousnessunbound.blogspot.com. And the Consciousness Unbound is one word.
Okay. Blogspot.com.
Right.
Okay. All right. I'll put a link for that in the show notes in the video description. And I will also put links for, since we talked about both books today, I'll put a link there. And I think that I might be able to find your page on Amazon that lists all of them and post that for people too.
Well, I would appreciate that. It's hard to get attention nowadays. There's so much going on out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a tricky thing.
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
get
Well,
your-
I enjoyed both books very much and appreciated them. So I highly encourage people to read all your work.
Well, thank you very much, and have a great day. Well,
All
by the
right,
way, may I ask, where are you?
I'm in Pasadena in California.
Oh, so you're on the. I should know that you're on. I was just wondering where you
Yeah.
were. Right, you're on the West Coast.
Yeah.
3 hours.
Yeah.
Take
That's
care of yourself.
likely going to change soon. I have to move
Yeah.
out of the house I'm in, so a little bit of a question of where I'm going.
All right. Well, wherever, good luck and carry
Yes.
on with the work.
Thank you. I shall.
All right.
All
Ciao
right.
then.
All right, goodbye. And that's a wrap on episode 87 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience or view this on Spotify. If you like what I do here on Rebel Spirit Radio and would like to support my work or show me a little love, then please consider becoming a patron. You can find a link for the Patreon in the show notes or video description. And of course, if you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can still do so via PayPal. I will be tremendously grateful for any support that you can provide. Another way that you can help the podcast is to share it with friends, family members, coworkers, anyone that you think will enjoy it. And please share it on social media too. It really is one of the best ways that you can help and support the podcast. So if you feel moved by the rebel spirit, and As always, I sure hope that you do. Then please, by all means, help me spread the good news. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. And please subscribe. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you'll be informed when I upload new content. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.